understanding what glorification, what opulence, and what popular culture means. This is why I'm pretty honored to be the Prime Minister in today's debate, because understand that this debate isn't going to be about construing what these three terms mean. This debate can't be about trying to create a parallel world in which we try to redefine what glorification and popular culture means. So let me break it down. Let me make it quite simple. Three things. Firstly, we think that glorification ultimately looks like creating a celebrity status around something, right? It looks like prioritizing something. It looks like saying that this is the epitome and this is what things ought to look like. We think opulence is something that's quite important because we think opulence is having great wealth and luxuriousness, right? So a couple of nuances here. We think having great wealth and luxuriousness is firstly having something that is beyond your needs, right? We think this then changes based on societies. So we think that opulence and luxuriousness changes based on basically what a person is able to achieve. So this is going to become more important further on in my speech. But lastly, let's just talk about popular culture. We think popular culture is things like media, right? It's things like music, films, and celebrity. But we think three important things on popular culture. Firstly, popular culture is incredibly pervasive. We think secondly, it entrenches our expectations. And lastly, it normalizes narratives in our society, right? Points of contextual clarity. Firstly, let's talk about what popular culture ultimately looks like, right? So we think ultimately what popular culture does is it creates expectations in our society. How does it do this? We see this through things like the media being used for things like propaganda, right? We see this by the media being used through things like advertising. The reason I mention these examples is because it's very important to note that popular culture isn't just about depictions, but it's about creating narratives in society about desire and what you ought to achieve. We think, let's talk about like the reality of society. The reality is that it's very hard to attain wealth. It's certainly much harder to attain like a state of luxuriousness. We think that we live in a society in which inequality is very entrenched. Why is this important in today's debate? Because we think, firstly, if we want people to achieve something, we need to give them realistic goals to achieve, right? So we're not saying that you aren't allowed to have your needs met. We're not saying you aren't allowed to live a good life. We say we regret luxuriousness because it is more than just a great life. It is about having something that is beyond what you need. What you define is a need for yourself, right? We think then, what this ultimately means is that you get a world in which people get disillusioned because like the 1% is real, right? We think it's very unlikely that people are going to be able to achieve this. We think secondly, the only people that are going to be able to achieve this are people who have access to privilege, right? People who have access to a large amount of opportunities, who have large amounts to access of basically like, it's very dependent on things like your class, like your generational wealth, like your race. We think then two things become important. We think it becomes morally apparent for us to celebrate people based on arbitrary lottery of birth, right? But we think secondly, it becomes morally apparent for us to not celebrate people simply because they did not have access to this lottery of birth. But secondly, we think it's more than just not celebrating, right? And this is why the extension of popular culture becomes important. Because it's not just to say that we don't want that life, it's to say that we create a world in which these people are not meeting our expectations. So ultimately, we think that it's more than just aspiring to something. We think that it's ultimately breaking people down for not having achieved something that they firstly didn't have control over. But secondly, it's a very unrealistic standard to expect people to achieve this. So why don't we want this in our society? 2 points of preemptive rebuttal. We'll tell you that sure, like they're going to say, well, this like motivates people to achieve things, and even if they don't achieve luxuriousness, at least they like have a better life, right? 2 things. Firstly, we think that it is completely false to claim that satisfaction is based on an arbitrary criteria like wealth, right? We think satisfaction is based on your ability to marry your reality with your expectations. So at a point where someone doesn't meet their expectations, it's very unlikely they'll have satisfaction, even if they're able to like achieve somewhat more wealth, right? We tell you that on the comparative, it is better for people to have realistic standards and to have goals which are relatively attainable for them, right? We tell you that the reason why we don't like the glorification of this specific kind of thing is again because it's very unrealistic. But what happens when people don't achieve it? Firstly, they get disillusioned, right? Which means that the kind of clapback you get from people like maybe being motivated is going to be converse, because when they realize they can't achieve this, it's most likely that they're just going to be disillusioned and they're going to be very, very disappointed, right? And we think that's particularly harmful, especially if we work on this idea that like pain and pleasure is very important metrics metrics of measuring what we value in society. And when something causes people pain, we think that even if they get closer to attaining wealth, we think it's particularly harmful. But then let's talk a little bit more about privilege, right? Because we think creating a celebrity status around someone who is wealthy is harmful, because we think people who are wealthy already have privilege in society, right? They already have disproportionate access to things like opportunities, they have disproportionate access to things like services, to things like rights through their lobbying ability. We think then you further entrench this when you celebrate people in society specifically for being wealthy and for having opulence. Let's talk about why it's also false to assume that people will be happier under this context. Because we think, firstly, simply attaining, even if you attain luxuriousness and wealth. So this is under the assumption that people somehow attain luxuriousness and wealth through the perpetuation of it in popular culture, right? We don't think this is the case. But even if it was, we think people would still more likely be unhappy, right? And we think that this is because having luxuriousness and wealth doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be happy, right? This is why we see the highest rates of suicide being among very wealthy businessmen. But we think, secondly, it creates a world in which people are reckless, because the kind of the spending that you see in popular culture isn't even one where you're investing in things, where you are doing things that make you happy. It's just spending recklessly and spending on things that you don't need, right? And we think that's particularly harmful for two reasons. Because number one, you don't get any kind of productivity in society when people are just recklessly spending, right? But secondly, it's again less likely to translate to material gain for these people when they aren't investing in things that are going to give them some kind of return. They're just kind of recklessly spending on things like cars or on things like jewelry, right? We think that's the kind of opulence that popular culture propagates. We think that's the kind of opulence that we specifically regret in our society. But then let's lastly just talk about again the extent to which we think it's a realistic aim, it's a realistic goal for people to set. And I want to highlight this again, panel. We think, number one, setting unrealistic goals for people is, number one, setting them up for failure, right? We think, number two, it means that when they don't achieve these goals, they're very disillusioned and very disappointed. But number three, we don't actually even agree with any analysis that comes from that side, saying that this motivates people, because it doesn't, right? We think generally privilege structures are very
Honourable Speaker, the reality of the world we live in is that it is necessarily unequal. What we think, though, is that it isn't the burden of individuals who have amassed wealth through their own hard work, not one, to celebrate that wealth, and two, to feel bad or to feel like they have a duty to play, a direct duty to play in equalizing the society. That is the mistake that the government bench makes. Four things in this speech. Firstly, we need to recognize that this is a debate that requires us to do a retrospective analysis. What this means is that we need to look at either what an alternative world would look like, and secondly, we need to look at a criteria for regrettability, which we don't get from opening government. Second, we need to look at the societal role of pop culture and why necessarily this sector of society doesn't have regrettability when it comes to opulence. Because we're willing to accept that certain sectors of society, for instance, like government officials who glorify opulence at the extent when they live, for instance, in very poor societies, we think that perhaps things like that would be regrettable given the direct obligation that they have. Third, we'd look at why this world at best is better and at worst is not regrettable. And then lastly, we need to look at why the harms in popular culture don't necessarily permeate as viscerally as the government would argue. The first argument, then, the retrospective analysis. We think that the alternative world, what the alternative world would look like or would have looked like had this glorification not happened, is something that we don't get from the government, and that is necessarily the burden of the government when we're looking at a debate that is retrospective. We think that in terms of criteria, what we would argue is that there are two things that we needed to look at in this debate in particular. Firstly, whether or not these harmful effects are completely undoable, at worst or at best, aren't able, for instance, to be improved in some ways. No, thank you. Secondly, we'd also need to ask ourselves whether or not this regrettability is well placed. I've already made an argument about why this regrettability isn't so. We argue then further that the harms, if any, are self-correcting in some ways, because we think that there are critical mass of celebrities who themselves recognize when they do have harmful behavior. We think that though that sort of thing is we're able to celebrate, but we think that on the other end, again, they don't have this obligation. But more importantly, onto the second argument about what the societal role of pop culture is. We think that the only thing that Anam gets right is that it is indeed a world that is different from the world that we live in. It is necessarily a world that is unrealistic. It is necessarily a world that doesn't speak to the lived realities of individuals. What does this mean? Firstly, we think that there is a critical mass of individuals who understand this. A lot of people in the world who are adults, even children, aren't stupid and don't think that necessarily, for instance, that that is what the real world is. However, we think that it isn't fair for the government to rubbish the aspirational value that the glorification of this opulence and what kind of meaning that could give to individuals' lives. We think that that's something that's important. But also we think that because glorification is a critical point in this debate, we think that the outward valuing of that opulence is something that's important. Why is this true? We think that individuals within societies, especially within pop culture, we think that it is one of the industries that people of color have been able to entrench and have been able to get into. Why is this important? Because the glorification of this opulence means that individuals who come from tough backgrounds, individuals who themselves have worked very hard to get to where they are, individuals who in the past were only props to be seen and to be viewed by white people, now themselves through their very hard work are able to not only amass wealth in themselves, but glorify that very objective, not arbitrary measure of success, which in itself necessarily within pop culture is wealth and is opulence. We think that in that way, we think that is the societal role of pop culture, and that is why opulence is a specific important, and why that is something that's specifically important. Further, we think that the glorification of opulence is something that justifies black people becoming owners of their wealth, an argument that I've already made. We think that that's something that's very important. Thirdly then, why is this world better, or why is this world something that is not regrettable? We think that important to understand here is that the amassing of great wealth or the undoing thereof, like I've said, is not the duty of celebrities themselves. We think that what is more important is for us to recognize that we live in a world that is consistently changing. We think that the existence of individuals like Beyonce and Jay-Z who are billionaires, even in a world, for instance, that is, and we'll concede that it is a world that is unfair and a world that is unequal, we think that the existence of individuals like that is something that in itself is something that is worth celebrating. Lastly then, why harms in pop culture don't actually permeate as viscerally as what is alleged?
Okay, if you concede that pop culture as a counter-public is what is unrealistic and harmful, why do you still want to continue glorifying it and glorifying and why do you want audiences to consume that?
One, it's unrealistic, but we've said that individuals themselves, a large number of individuals are aware that that's true. But secondly, we'll show you why it isn't as harmful as what you'd say. The first thing we'd say here is that there is really only a small percentage of individuals who are, for instance, moved, for instance, into like making reckless financial decisions about their lives in order to amass the celebrity status. We think that if that is the harm, it's something that comes from internal societal pressures where you don't, for instance, want to be embarrassed because your neighbors have a certain kind of lifestyle and they're going to certain kinds of schools. We think that within societies, it is internal pressures that individuals are more, for instance, affected by than what happens outwardly. We think that that's a very important separation to make as to why, again, the harms don't necessarily exist or aren't necessarily inherent to pop culture necessarily. We think that there are many examples of where these harms themselves haven't permeated as viscerally. We think that it is a very harmful stereotype or a very harmful perception of individuals, specifically people of color within the entertainment industry. When, for instance, there have always been arguments about how black rappers encourage young black men to be gangbangers, or they encourage women, or they encourage, for instance, the use of sex, drugs, and alcohol. We think that while a small percentage of this is true, it isn't necessarily something. It isn't necessarily something, for instance, that permeates as viscerally. But more than that, we think that there are specific. We think that in a world that we live in, there are harms. But the harms that exist in this specific debate are harms that, one, aren't for the celebrities themselves to correct. Secondly, are a reality of what celebrity culture looks like. But thirdly, and most importantly, are a reality. Are a reality of the hard work that individuals have done. We don't think, Mr. Speaker, that it is fair that Beyonce, who is the hardest working woman in entertainment and the best performer of our lifetime, shouldn't be able to celebrate the hard work that she puts in. We think that a woman who can come back from pregnancy in a year and put on the best performance Coachella has ever seen in their lives shouldn't be able to celebrate the value that we get from that. We think that wealth in itself is wealth in and of itself is an objective measure of the success that individuals make. We think that because celebrity work, because singing and dancing is real work and the kind of value that we gain as a society from that industry is one that they themselves should be able to bring back. We think that it is we think that it is on society to glorify this work that happens. These harms that we speak about are at worst unrealistic, but at best we think that celebrities themselves do deserve this recognition. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Honorable Speaker, even in a world where we don't celebrate Beyonce's millions, we don't take away from the fact that she's the best performer of our lifetime. The logical gap in Lehakoe's example is to say that the two are linked. We don't necessarily think that they are dependent on each other. We don't also necessarily think that they are propagating of each other. The idea, therefore, is we can celebrate these people's struggles, we can celebrate these people's achievements, we can celebrate these people's talents. We don't necessarily have to attach the wealth that they've amassed to be able to validate that status. A couple of things in response. The first thing is to say, she says people have got a right to celebrate their wealth. True, we don't necessarily think that it should be driven into popular culture. The problem with Lehakoe's speech, right, is most of it just talks about why it's okay to be opulent. But she misses the context of the fact that this is unpopular culture. So when she says, I've got a right to celebrate my wealth, she doesn't tell us why she's got a right to celebrate her wealth on TV. So this is something that she must tell us from Deputy Leader of Opposition speech. The second thing they tell us is to say, oh, you didn't give us a criteria for regret. I mean, I'm sorry you didn't access Anam's sophisticated speech, but she spent a lot of time explaining to you what the criteria for regret is. The first thing she tells you is, listen, we're going to regret this thing if it's like harmful. Secondly, she tells you that if the harms are irreparable. Thirdly, that if there's no accountability mechanisms. And lastly, if the harms are self-propagating in the long term. That's a sufficient like metric for regret, right? Then she says, no, in reality, these things are repairable. False. The first thing is celebrities are hard to call out. But even in instances where we call them out, we have got limited access to really hold them to account because we only call them out on Twitter, which really does nothing. But the second thing is to say that even when they go to court, they are much more likely to afford the richest lawyer in New York, or just simply, like, literally quite speaking, it would be hard for a black judge to convict Beyonce of anything. And this is extremely true. Like, then she tells us there's an idea of aspirational value. Like, notice how this was preempted by Anam in the first 2 minutes of her speech. We regret the fact that you want people to have aspirations of attaining value through wealth in the first place. But even in a world where all you just wanted to encourage was people to be able to access upward social mobility, within you don't necessarily like have to force it into them. It's something that they can unilaterally decide for themselves without buying it from pop culture. So the difference there is aspirational value should not be coerced. Aspirational value should be inherent. It's autonomous. It's like your aspirations from your heart, not from TV. Like then she tells us like, we want to celebrate upper social mobility. We want to show that these people hustled and now they're here. Listen, in the vast majority of cases, when you watch these shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, like Wags, like The Rich Kids of Beverly Hills, there is never context on the fact that these people were once poor. But secondly, there is never context on the fact that these people worked hard to get here. The only content that you really see is that these people are incredibly rich and you should be rich like them, right? But then the last thing is to say, even in a world where we should celebrate their upper social mobility, why is it always necessary for them to seek validation from the masses? Why should they seek validation from poor people who don't have the similar aspirations? The final thing to say in this, in response, is to say, well, there's limited people that make reckless financial decisions, and her explanation is to say this is inherent in society. Like neighbors, like put pressure on each other to like attain better things. Listen, if I come from the ghetto and my neighbor buys a DSTV. Pretty okay, that's pressure. But listen, if Kim Kardashian says you can't be happy in life if you don't have a Bentley, the scale is much grand, but secondly, there's probably much more influence in pressuring me into specific decisions. It's also realistically false to say that very few people make those reckless financial decisions. 60% of girls on campus really spend a shitload of their money buying expensive makeup that they cannot afford, buying Brazilian weaves that they really don't need, and buying phones that they can't even take care of. Those are the examples of realistic people on the ground that make reckless financial decisions out of the aspirational value that Lehakoe talks about in her speech. The reality, Madam Speaker, is there's a lot of coercion to be understood about opulence, specifically on popular culture. They need to come back to the context of this debate and engage us on popular culture, on things like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, on things like Wags, on things like Cribs and The Rich Kids of Beverly Hills, right? So let's get to the audience. This is important context. There are three actors mostly in the audience. The first one is poor people who have to spend shitloads of money on accessing American TV just so they can watch rich people flaunting. Like the second group is young women of color whose behavior is conditioned by like the beauty standards of Kim Kardashian and all of her plastic surgery pursuing sisters, right? But the final ones are other rich people that are invited into this culture because it has been normalized, right? So let me engage on why this is specifically important context. Firstly, consumerism. In the vast majority of cases, Madam Speaker, people make these reckless financial decisions because they've been told that at a point at which they don't have the same access to the things that these people have, they are insufficient as human beings, but they can never truly attain happiness. Why is this problematic? Because it propagates a system of capitalism that these people are also part of, right? Like Kylie Jenner advertises her product on her show where she's telling you that you can only be happy if you use this specific type of lipstick. Why should poor people be used as social battering rams for rich people to make more money firstly on the show but also make more money on the lipstick? You need to understand that the viewers in this case are not just like aspiration, the people who aspire to be like them, or just like people who are autonomously choosing to be here. This shit is incredibly addictive. These things have been like going on for like 22 seasons because realistically speaking, who has got the money and the power to remove the Kardashians from TV? This is something that they don't explain to us, right? But the second thing is to say, you teach people a culture of easy money. Like, the people on WAGs really don't do anything beyond entertain rich people and then marry them in the long term, right? But also secondly, you teach our young girls to be petty, vain, and plastic. You force them to aspire to likes and to followers on Instagram because that is always the end goal on shows like this. It's just validation. That is all that you pursue when you show people that you have money. You just want them to validate your wealth because it's a value somehow, right? But also the other thing is to say that like it deeply entrenches like classes because at a point at which there are interclass relations, the rich people now are legitimized at flaunting their wealth against poor people. The problem there is the violence that this has on people that can never truly meaningfully attain that level of wealth. They feel insufficient, but also they feel inferior. This is why black kids who from the townships feel very inferior when they go to debating tournaments against these private school kids in very fancy blazers because they all have iPhones, coaches, accents, and like all of the things that you see on these shows, right? But the last thing is to say that we, like wealthy people, never get to acknowledge their privilege or engage with it because now it's okay to celebrate your privilege. Now it's okay to throw your privilege around. Recognize, panel, that popular culture is an incredibly influential force on TV.
You need to understand in today's debate that the very same people that are saying that pop culture is setting unrealistic goals are the people that consume the very same thing. Mfumo and as well as Way are the very same individuals that consistently want to aspire to be like Beyonce. But that does not necessarily mean that they are that they are under pressure of actually trying to attain those things, or they consistently place themselves in the positions where they want to have those things currently. The second thing also to recognize here is that everyone sets wealth as a defining factor for their success, which means you are here at Wales right now because you want to succeed and you want to have a lot of money. This does not necessarily mean that pop culture sets unrealistic goals for most of these individuals, especially when Lehakoe speaks about how this is something that's very empowering from someone who comes from a minority group. Seeing like a black queer woman in pop culture, it's something that's very inspiring as an individual. It simply shows you that just because you are facing those specific struggles, it still does not mean that you cannot attain the wealth or cannot attain the achievements that you want. Even thirdly, when they talk about how like oftentimes these are people that come from positions of privilege, we say sure, but we also need to understand that even from that privilege, when individuals were able to emerge and create something out of themselves, it's always as important than to give them credit for the fact that they were able to emerge. People like Kim Kardashian, who also think it's important to recognize the fact that they deserve to be celebrated for the amount of wealth that they have. Also finessing and talking about how like individuals are so stupid, they consistently consume pop culture and therefore they can't even make decisions for themselves. We say for shame. We say pop culture has consistently created like beauty standards for individuals, but that does not necessarily mean that people should be denied the opportunity to consume pop culture. That secondly, that does not also take away from like the value of pop culture in and of itself. Which simply means that even if you can still complain about class, even if you can still complain about those beauty standards, we don't think that it's an obligation of one individual to actually remove all the things that you were talking about in today's debate. We think it's unfortunate that this is an unequal society, and we think, ladies and gentlemen, we can't necessarily say that by stopping or regretting like the glorification of these individuals would necessarily stop all the things that Zoe speaks about in today's debate. They're going to lose today's debate on basis that the entire case is set on the idea that all of these individuals that emerge are like people that come from positions of privilege. We say for shame. We say even like people like Beyonce, that the person that we now celebrate, and also on basis that you can't necessarily celebrate an individual and detach themselves from the wealth that they have. We think this is something that you can't possibly do. Even if you still celebrate an individual, Beyonce as an icon, it still does not necessarily mean that you can take away from the fact that Beyonce is wealthy and now you want to consume the arts because of like Beyonce. We think this is something that we aren't willing to accept. So ultimately, opening government is out of this debate on two reasons. The first is because they fail to tell you how this glorification is something that's very harmful. When Lehakoe has already spoken to you about how individuals can still decide what they want to do, and how secondly, we need to allow individuals to consume pop culture on basis that it's not necessarily about setting this unrealistic standards, but oftentimes, especially for people that come from minority groups, it's something that's very empowering, and we think it's important for us to allow for individuals to actually consume this pop culture. And also this completely switches off what Mfumo is likely going to run, the idea of how he sets unrealistic goals, because I've already explained to you how this is something oftentimes can be realistic to these individuals. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand that the celebrity life is not the same as like your basic individual's lives, and how wealth, especially in the entertainment industry, it's something that's very important to an individual. What they're saying here, they want to set their bar so low to such an extent that just because an individual can rap about something, we ought to glorify that individual because they don't have money. We think even if it's important to glorify individuals because of like the arts or the things that they're able to do, it's important to understand that wealth sets the bar and allows for individuals to see wealth as a defining factor, and you can't simply run away from this idea by saying that it's important for us not to create standards or unrealistic expectations for these specific individuals. So going into my substantive matter, I'll be looking at two things. The first, I'll look at this idea of like how the Mfumo is likely going to run a case about how this entrenches the inequality in society, especially after this discussion that we had. And secondly, also, I'm going to talk about how wealth is a defining factor and it ought to stay as is, because I mean, we wouldn't be advanced if wealth wasn't a defining factor. The first, let's look at why they talk about how this entrenches inequality. The first thing here is to say that we are creating a capitalist society. This is also in response to what Zoe has already spoken about. We tell you here, ladies and gentlemen, by virtue of not necessarily glorifying these individuals, does not necessarily mean that you are able to like dismantle the capitalist society that we form. You need to understand and recognize that the class struggles, or like all these other struggles that he speaks about, is like the mandate of the government or like the state to actually deal with those things. And in as much as these individuals are very influential people, we still don't think that you are able to dismantle the capitalist society by virtue of dismantling this. But also secondly, when they fail to respond to the idea of how glorifying this individual is a form of celebrating the fact that a black woman, for example, or a black woman was able to emerge from being poor to this someone who's wealthy now. But before I continue, I'm going to take Mfumo.
Okay, Atlehang, you still as opposition having discharged your burden. Why is glorification a good thing and why would you accept it? Do that way.
Okay, so I've been telling you why glorification is something that's very important for a very long time. Because one, we told you that glorification is important in terms of like trying to empower these individuals, to also empower other people to see that these things are also as attainable. The second thing also is to say that glorification is also important for that specific individuals to celebrate the fact that they were able to achieve those things for themselves. What they're simply doing here is to say that we should not allow individuals to celebrate their fancy cars and their fancy lives on TVs, especially in pop culture, on basis that they're setting unrealistic standards. We say for shame, we say oftentimes individuals were able to even find inspiration or meaning of inspiration in looking at pop culture. But also secondly, we're saying that we should not stop individuals from consuming pop culture, even the glorification of pop culture, on basis that it has like the effect that they're talking about in today's debate. So ultimately, opening opposition is going to win today's debate because firstly, we think it's important for us to say that we don't think that like the glorification of these opulence is something that's very problematic, especially when we think that this isn't a celebrity life is different from an individual's life, and why it's important to understand that in the entertainment industry, it's always important for you as an individual to set trend in order to maintain the fan base that you have. At the point at which you're saying that these people should set the bar so low to such an extent that these are the things that are very unattainable, you aren't even able to create that sort of competition that exists. Because even if you can still say that you don't want that competition, you want to eliminate that competition within the entertainment industry, it's completely different, especially pop culture, it's completely different to what you're talking about. If you are for a side, the things that it's important for individuals to find meaning of aspirations by seeing other people from the same position achieving those things, you are watched to side.
am clearly a victim of opulence culture and its glorification. Two hands, I cannot use all of these devices at once. My consumption patterns have been wasteful. All of my debate coaching money has gone to trivial things because I have bought into the Beyonce culture of getting the bag. We think that wastefulness in and of itself as a value is something undesirable. Look at the silliness. 3 iPhones. What do I need 3 iPhones for? Nothing. I'm wasting resources that could have been better channeled to other people. Let's clarify some things that are very important to clarify in this debate. We are not saying don't celebrate powerful black women for their achievements, right? Let us celebrate Beyonce in all of her glory. Let me take the knee just now. This is me taking that knee to my queen Beyonce. Love her, love Serena, love these powerful black mbogotos who are in this final disseminating wisdom. However, we are not talking about the celebration of work and effort and reward. We're celebrating the consumption of excess. Opulence is wastefulness, not just getting a phone, getting the highest spec iPhone 10X Max 512 gigabytes so that I can say I have it in a debate, right? That is the culture that we are saying we regret. A criteria for regret to add to the criteria that has been given. We regret something when the values behind it create worse societies. We regret something when it creates low-value pursuits. The get the bag, get the swag culture. We regret that. We regret it when it hurts the public good. Now, what do we tell you? We don't actually want people to aspire to own more than they need. We think those aspirations are not healthy. We prefer people aspiring to make meaningful contributions to society. We prefer people aspiring to be on CAPs for WUDC like Lehakoe, aspiring to be in finals of pans like you, Atlehang. That's what we aspire for. Brilliance, hard work, effort, ethic, empathy. There are a multiplicity of values we don't think ought to be aspired to in status quo, right? So that's that. We also don't think there's anything wrong with being wealthy. We're not socialists. We think the celebration of over-consumption, opulence at your level, we think that definition was very clear. We don't want that. We think it's harmful. I hope that this explains the distinction we have from this side of the house. Now, our distinction from proposition. Proposition tells you what happens when someone gives up. They become miserable, they are sad, and perhaps they even commit suicide. Let me just help them with some analysis. That is what happens when society gets depressed. Differently, we tell you that many people actually will accept the challenge. They will do budget versions of opulence. They will go for squatting tendencies. And we tell you that in society, that budget version opulence at your level is equivalently harmful. And I'm going to show you why in the extension. Right. Now, also to distinguish ourselves from opening, pop culture is not just keeping up with the Kardashians' TV. It is also Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, influencers, the hip-hop music we listen to, the magazines we consume. All of these create a cow horn formation that engulfs you holistically and keeps reinforcing the message over and over again. It's not our case, you guys. It's not our case that pop culture influences everyone. Sure, there are smart debaters in the world, but there are many people who fall for it. We're also not saying people must not consume pop culture. We're saying that the values that of opulence in the pop culture are bad. That's what this debate is about. I hope it's clear. For engagement purposes, Lehakoe.
Okay, so you say that this consumption culture that comes from glorifying of opulence is something that's all-consuming. What is the metric then to assume that that is something that isn't of value to society that's created?
I'm about to tell you that. We also don't say it's all-consuming, by the way. We say that it highly influences many people and creates bad habits. Right now, one, we tell you that it creates brand chasing and brand consciousness. Exactly what I'm exhibiting here in my Apple fandom, my Adidas fandom. What are these diesel and these? Right? So it's a problem. It's a problem. I don't need these fancy things, to be honest. What we tell you is that that when you are poor, when you are a poor black man who's been struggling to pay for his university fees, when you chase this kind of thing, you don't direct your resources where they ought to go. And when you are coming from very rough neighborhoods, this trying to drink Hennessy, trying to skotane with ultramel, they take away resources from the household, from the nourishing of children, from places where childhood development and family development and community development could happen. We think that Puff Daddy and Jay-Z have been the most harmful people to the black culture because they've told them to drink Ciroc, then they got Casper to tell people to drink Ciroc, then they got AKA to tell people to drink Cruise. And all of those young black men, they're not spending that money on furthering their education, etc., etc. They are spending it to get recognition and doing it for the gram. By the way, these days we don't do it for our neighbors, we do it for the gram, right? That pressure exists more and we regret it, we think it's problematic, right? And for the people who can't attain these things through legitimate means like debate coaching, guess what they do? They'll hijack you as you exit the building. They'll hijack you as you come to this competition, waiting at Park Station. Sorry, my brother, when that happened. Like, we think crime is exacerbated by the glorification of that particular instance, right? Sit down. But further than that, more than that, we tell you these values of wastefulness and narcissism are problematic. These are the unique harms that we identify in this glorification. These values are problematic. Wastefulness is problematic because things must be used according to your need. If you have more things than you need, you are wasting resources that could otherwise have been redeployed. We think that a society that promotes wastefulness in and of itself is a bad society. We tell you further that this promotes narcissism. Why am I wearing all of these things? Because somehow I've been programmed to have a look at me syndrome. What does a look at me syndrome create? It creates a narcissistic, selfish individual. One who doesn't want to collaborate, one who has no empathy for his fellow man. So when he's asked to contribute, when he's asked to help black people in Alexandria, when he's asked to reach out and help solve social problems, he says, not my problem, I don't want to pay taxes and I'm going to do a tax revolt or I'm going to vote for the Purple Cow Party. It comes from this kind of thing, the glorification of opulence. These values, wastefulness and narcissism, are not the kind of values we teach our children. And lastly, we tell you, all of this drives capitalism, which then drives CO2 consumption, ice caps melting, and further, it increases the risk of the environment collapsing. So we regret this thing.
That was a very interesting commercial break because we needed the break after the first half. Unfortunately, the one thing that's only admirable about Jamie's case is that it is incredibly enterprising in that he shows us products that he has. He doesn't really tell us anything else beyond the spectrum of what they're trying to prove and close in government. I respect Jamie incredibly as a debater, but quite simply, they do not have any distinguishing factor compared to anything that we get in opening government. The debate continues now. Welcome to the program. What we're going to be telling you here is a couple of fundamental things, right? We do not think that this debate essentially, as the assessment that has been asserted in opening, is necessarily about the people like Beyonce and Cardi B, etc. We think that that can actually exist. We think those are actors that are valuable in assessing. What we want to argue in our part in closing our position is assess the psychological and philosophical assessment of an individual. What does this necessarily mean? We do not think that human beings inherently are altruistic people that are going to limit their desires, interests, and wants purely based on the fact that a society that has been manned to actually disenfranchise certain people is the best mechanism to do that. A couple of rebuttals that we have, right? And this is just like in response, generally in principles, what we hear in the opening half, what we hear in, the government bench, right? First of all, what they tell you there is that inequality is exacerbated by these things, right? First of all, we say that is not true. Why do we say this? One, we tell you that you're actually giving leeway to a lot of governments that have actually allowed the deregulation of states, right? Where they actually incentivize class systems to actually be perpetuated. We think with things like the Roman Empire, before pop culture existed, before all these pervasive natures of media were actually there were still these systems. Caste systems that ensured that classism, overconsumption, and materialism were a thing. We're supposed to be having the debate about the mechanism in which these things are emboldened. Quite simply put, they do not show you why that's possible under their side of the house. But more importantly, they tell you that it perpetuates beauty standards that are incredibly harmful. We tell you the beauty standards and standards that tell men that they need to have six-packs, they need to have all kinds of things, they need to have watches, are indoctrinations that do not necessarily permeate specifically from media, but permeate from dogmas that are perpetuated by women that essentialize those things, but more importantly, by men that harbor value systems systems that tell you that because you're a guy, you need to have certain things. Those things are therefore just a manifestation when you see them on television. Understand that television and pop culture is an inorganic way of morphing society's values. Because what we tell you there is that you manifest values by actually telling people in person what those things are, right? If you want to question the system of society, then you should start at the grassroots level. Things like universities that theorize the way we engender the way we want to interact with the rest of society. But more importantly, the way in which we understand the ideas of things like glorification. Overconsumption is the premise of the iPhone commercial. Encouraged by popular culture, they say. What we tell you more here, importantly, ladies and gentlemen, as part of our context, is that we do not believe this is true for a couple of premises. First of all, we tell you that there's a cultural relativity that exists on our side of the house because we recognize that not every single society buys into this. In fact, South Africa is one of the most hyper-consumerist countries. We do not think that's only incentivized purely by the fact that popular culture is pervasive. In fact, we do not have a sophisticated media industry. That claim in and of itself shows you that hyper-consumerism is not necessarily premised on AKA being on a billboard on the M2 highway, but more importantly, because we necessarily have post-colonial traumatic experiences that they're talking about that are perpetuated by inequality. Quite simply put, we do not think that the kind of system that we're talking about when we talk about things like over-consumerism happen purely because of that, right? Save your case, Jamie.
So tell us, is it legitimate for Floyd Mayweather to own 6 of the same Bentleys? Do you think that kind of culture is worth it and that wastefulness is useful in society to promote?
So here's the other thing, right? We understand that there's a problem with people like Floyd Mayweather and other celebrities like Puff Daddy actually owning a lot of things. But we do not think that those people necessarily have the kind of influence that you are placing under your side of the house. But more importantly, even if that necessarily existed, ladies and gentlemen, what we're trying to prove to you under our side of the house is that materialism in and of itself is not something that is only exacerbated by the media. What do we tell you specifically, and why do we think that glorification as an outcomes-based driven thing is something worth valuing in closing opposition? Firstly, we tell you that human beings innately have desires, right? There is a difference between having needs and desires. We understand under that side of the house that altruism is a case that they're trying to run, that human beings ought to recognize the kind of privilege that they have. But recognize under our side of the house what we're advocating for is a couple of things. Firstly, that we need to actually appease to those desires because you do not deal with them objectively, right? But secondly, more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that material things are the way in which society is promulgated. Look at this magnificent building that you're in and of itself. Relatively speaking, this could be a form of some kind of opulence for other people. Because you need to recognize, importantly, that the understanding on their side of the house is incredibly reductionist in that they only view materialistic things like watches and Cirocs, etc., as the only form of that. They give you a very shallow definition of what that necessarily means. I'll take Zoe. Yeah.
It's very easy and lazy to say these things aren't mutually connected, that's caused by popular culture. We told you in response to the happen that it happens at a greater scale, but also you need to tell us why, because it happens at a status quo, why should you encourage more?
Why should we encourage? That was a good POI, but unfortunately, the context in which it's placed is just not important in the debate. Purely placed on the idea that we think that even when you have a lot of materialistic things, again, it's not just based on the idea that people are being materialistic because of pop culture. That is what we're trying to prove to you into the house today. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, why do we think that this is important? We're going to tell you something here. Pop culture in and of itself is premised on the idea of opulence. What does this mean? Now that we've established what opulence is in and of itself, we tell you that that thing is universally desirable. It is built up on the premise of people wanting things that are universally desirable. While we might have people that are inherently altruistic and people that necessarily tell us that we need to sort of like limit our own desires, we think that certain things are inherently desirable. Things like cars, right? Things like houses, relative to the kinds of circumstances in which you can afford those things. They do not give us some kind of metric as to what is necessarily opulence and why it is incredibly excessive, right? All the harms that they give you under their side of the house are irrelevant. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that popular culture at the end of the day is a manifestation of what happens in society when the translation of things like class system, deregulation necessarily are allowed to happen. They do not show you how popular culture in and of itself has a monopoly on these things, because that was the premise that they were supposed to justify, while the monopolization of popular culture is in and of itself an instrumental value in how those people can actually ensure that young people like myself drink nothing but Ciroc. I'm a black label guy, but I still think that these things are worth talking about. Consumerism is not just premised on the idea of popular culture. Try again.
Ladies and gentlemen, debate banter doesn't win you debates. Nero spent all of his time just bantering the government, and he only starts his extension at the 6 minutes where he doesn't even analyze what he meant. Where was this extension? It's like it's premised on opulence and we need to analyze opulence. I won't waste time with CO specifically, but I will engage OO and I will engage our extension and explain why we win this debate exclusively. Note in this debate panel that we gave an additional layer layer to the definition of opulence, especially around pop culture. Here, we say pop culture is about excess, to a point where even when you don't afford the real thing, you will always go to want to access the cheapest form of that thing or the worst or fake version of that thing. We say the danger in that is the danger that comes in the glorification. I asked the POI to Lehakoe to say, discharge your burden. Why do you want to glorify? Debate 101, need to start there. Their burden is not to show that, their burden is not to show that pop culture and people within the pop culture industry have worked hard and they have to stay there and we have to celebrate them. Their burden is to show in this debate, like, why is glorification an okay thing? Because by analysis for the entire government page, we say that glorification comes with standards. Glorification comes with luxuriousness. Glorification comes with unattainable standards to the most point of the time where, even in our extension, we argue that these unattainable standards, you go even for the Fong Kongs on the side, right? Additionally, even go to, resort to going to things like crime to attain those things. We say there isn't engagement from Nero. He does just banter into this debate. I'll take you guys, not yet, okay? The criteria around how it creates also first the second idea of low value pursuits, right? But also hurts the public good, and I'll analyze this at the end, right? But we tell you again that many people, and again there's a specific nuance that Nero misses because he likes to joke a lot, is that people who consume pop culture accept the challenge. Atlehang is right that yes, I do want to get the finest thing. I want to have the most likes on Instagram. I want to seek those things because as a result of pop culture, because it's in my face, what's trending, who's wearing what, who's not wearing what. We think that kind of analysis can't be ignored in this debate, but additionally, you can't go and not justify why the glorification of such things is an okay thing if you as a team even note that pop culture as a counter public is unrealistic. We say there's a logical fallacy, and I'll show it in this case, right? We tell you again, and there's an inconsistent line from opening a position because Lehakoe analyzes around societal role of pop culture, and she concedes that it's unrealistic. Atlehang comes and says to you that, look, the reason for glorification that I went after as the POI is that we want people to be empowered, want people to seek wealth. Note that you want people to seek wealth and empowerment from the thing that you deem unrealistic in this debate. We say that logical fallacy makes you lose the debate because you are inconsistent. But let's accept it in your sense and say, look, what's this? Pop culture, pop culture as a thing. We say now the rationality of individuals for opting into this thing is then not clear. Because the reason why I want to buy the most expensive phone or buy the most expensive clothing or what is trending now is because I've seen it on pop culture. I've seen it on Kim K do it. I've seen it on Beyonce do it, right? She says then that we don't want to celebrate good people. We say hardworking people. We say the likes of Beyonce's also benefit from pop culture. I'm a Beyonce fan, and I can tell you right now that colorism is what put Beyonce where she is over Kelandra, her significant other. We tell you that she is light-skinned. She has blonde hair, right? She's the most acceptable to the norm within pop culture. So you want to glorify those norms. This is why people like Michelle, and Angelina was calling me Michelle, she's gone. But people like O'Kelly wouldn't survive in the industry of pop culture because of those things, right? So the glorification thereof is harmful. Then we show you we wouldn't glorify this. Quickly.
Okay, so sure. One, a lot of stuff that you say about like the really bad stuff in pop culture is irrelevant to this debate. But two, the link between wealth and work is that because individuals in pop culture gain their recognition through their opulence and they show that through their wealth, that's why that glorification is important, specifically in this industry.
Yes.
That's how we justify it.
Yes, but that's why we say our harm is access, because you want to glorify something of people who already have wealth of those things, and you want to glorify it to people who don't have access to those things. At the point in time, the harms that I spoke about and the harms that Jamie speaks about at the end of the day are then exacerbated because they don't have the wealth to attain the opulence that they see on Twitter to see on Facebook or on Instagram on the likes, right? We say the second question that we need to analyze here, and this is where's the page? Yes, this comes from the values that pop culture pushes, the values of narcissistic behavior, the values of wastefulness. Here, we need to know that rape culture, skin bleaching. We tell you that drinking expensive alcohol at clubs, you drink champagne, darling, because you look cool. We say those things are remnants of pop culture. If you're unable to buy a pop culture, you are then expected in clubs like Taboo, where the rape culture is literally where men just take girls because they bought them champagne and rape them. Where we tell you instances around skin bleaching being the highest industry in cosmetics for people wanting to seek lightness or being light in complexion, right? The harm then is colorism. The harm there is rape culture. The harm there is wanting to access things that the opulent people in pop culture have and the viewers of that opulence do not have. We win this debate by discharging that burden, right? We tell you again on the last question of I have so many pages, sorry. Okay. Okay, yeah. On the last question on how this then creates brand chasing, right? We tell you we create brand chasing over and above the fact that we have made pop culture a glorified category, right? We tell you glorification, and also by the addition to the criteria by Jamie, that it creates unattainable values. So we value things that we cannot attain by the positionality of where we are, right? This then, we chase brands in order to trend or in order to exist around the sphere of pop culture, right? We tell you this is harmful again because pop culture in its inherent nature is also consumerist, right? It's consumerist in its nature. I mean, it's consumerist in its nature that the people who consume pop culture and the people who consume this glorified opulence aren't able to meet up to that standard. And at the point when they aren't able to meet up to this standard, they become the other, right? This is why when students get to universities and don't have weaves, don't have iPhones, don't have all these flashy things that pop culture splats on our faces, aren't able to then exist in that space, and then they become the other, and then we discriminate on those kinds, right? We say a team that's going to win this final is a team that becomes sincere to the motion, but also becomes sincere to the burdens that we have. We think that closing opposition doesn't have that. This motion must fall. Thank you.
As I was sitting, I was scanning the audience. And what is fascinating is that we have the extreme spectrum that this debate wishes us to engage. We have Tiamo, who is one of the most minimalistic people that I ever know. And then we have Jamie with his weird flexes, but okay. But the reason why that and then somewhere in the middle is the majority of us, right? We are either more minimalistic or more consumerist. But the reason why that is important is because it casts a lot of doubt on the stuff this bench has been running on. That individuals are so stupid, that they are so reckless, and they would spend everything that they want because Beyonce uses like Kylie Jenner makeup or something. But secondly, the reason why it is important is because it shows, I would like to assume that both of these individuals that I used in my intro are happy with their lives, or relatively so. What this means is that we tell you is what the extension now was getting at, that individuals have innate pleasures and desires, and they try to fulfill these either through viewing pop culture or through being Jamie and just actually attaining it themselves. But the reason why it is important is that people are able to both be happy and still rational regardless of where they are on the spectrum. The reason why this bench is not strategically sound is because they are very grossly exaggerated. They tell us that individuals are reckless to the extent wherein they put their materialistic desires before everything else. What we tell you is firstly that individuals are able to relate this and internalize it within their own contexts. A lot of you here have natural hair, and I applaud you for embracing your natural hair, because it just shows that the extent of which they are trying to paint the harm isn't true. But more than that, we think that a lot of the harms that they try to characterize are actually not negated on their side. We tell you exclusively in closing opposition that popular culture is a manifestation of society's desires desires, not the creation of it. They needed to engage the burden of showing us why pop culture creates these desires as opposed to necessarily manifest it. Extensively, though, we believe that because of these desires that humans have, it's either we oftentimes let them explore this through like allowing for this glorification, because at the end of the day, we all like aesthetics. We all like nice things. If we can't necessarily accrue them ourselves, because not all of us are fortunate enough to be like Beyonce, as OO speaks of, at least let us view it. At least let us watch TV. Because the important thing to understand is that pop culture as an industry only survives if we are consumerists, only survives if we glorify this, because that's what fuels it. That's what fuels the market, and that's what we want to consume on our televisions. This side has been very disingenuous towards that. Mfumo does not do any sort of rebuttal. He just strawmans, right? Note that panel. So, what do we tell you then? We tell you the first thing to engage is the premises on this bench. The idea that inequality is so rampant, and all what this does is exacerbate that. Anam starts this off telling us about like the lottery of birth. We think this is adequately like rebuffed by our opening, telling you how it actually creates avenues for minorities to circumvent the lottery of birth. But what we tell you in extension to that, in extension of that, is the fact that we live in a capitalist world and we live in a consumerist world. The problem with our circuit is that we are at the point where we think saying the word capitalism is automatically an argument. No, we need to understand that by virtue of the world that we live in, we ought to try to live our best lives and maximize that human desire that we have within that context. They don't do this on their side because all they say is they shun you for looking at Kylie Jenner. We say no. Escapism is oftentimes a legitimate thing for humans to want. If the structural issues they talk about is so bad and oppressive, allow us at least to see nice things if we can't have them. That is important, and you only get that from closing opposition. The other thing to address, no, sit down, you guys took no one. The other thing to then address is the idea that individuals cannot be happy, and this is also something that the closing tries to run on, but let's note that they have no extension. They tell us essentially the same thing, just with weird flexes and stuff like that, right? But understand that happiness comes from your ability to be happy within yourself, within that society that you live in. We think oftentimes individuals are able to make sacrifices, and sure, even if I chase brands and I buy like one Adidas branded shirt every 3 months, that is me getting closer to fulfilling that desire because it's still something that I value as a human being. We think that we should be able to indulge ourselves every now and then, but what we can always do is rely on this glorification of pop culture to always feed us what we crave, what we want. They don't engage with this on their side. I will take closing, yes.
Americans are in debt because of using money they don't have to buy things they don't need.
Okay, thank you. So Nero responded to this already, right? Because consumerism is often about the propensities to spend within societies. We tell you why South Africa also has a lot of that is because we are a community, as a country, we just have like a large propensity to spend any sort of additional income. You don't solve this on your side because of glorification, because that's just a manifestation of what we already want. The way to do this is what Nero tells you. It's about changing and having real discourses in universities or things like that, and uplift and changing like the societal mindsets that we already have. Ultimately, we value pop culture because it exists to give us the indulgence that we oftentimes crave and that we sometimes need. But the other thing to then engage is the idea that the individual ought to be altruistic. They tell us that we should try to socially engineer society away from what they claim to be bad things, such as drinking and having 6 cars. The reality is, again, my intro, not all of us here want 6 Bentleys, but also not all of us here would even have those even if we could, right? So that is up to the individual, and that's an individual way up that needs to be made. The important thing, though, is to understand that they can't place this huge ass burden on individuals to be so altruistic that they have to deny their pleasures if they wish to indulge them and have the means to do so. The harm that they want to solve is reckless spending. This is inherent to individuals being uneducated about financial literacy and things like that, and that's not like a classist argument. It exists across all class brackets. But the important thing is that individuals ought to be able to either escape societal pressures that they talk about, if that's so necessary, or to indulge themselves if they can. That's not what we need to fulfill. But ultimately then, why do we win this debate? Because we tell you that if we value pop culture as an industry itself, and this is why we also place above our OO, they tell you pop culture is valuable because it changes how we define success and allows for other individuals to accrue wealth. We tell you pop culture can only exist as an industry if it glorifies the people who have accrued those wealth, because that's when we have people sitting at their TVs and consuming this. We would not watch the Kardashians if they lived the same lives we had. We would not watch Being Bonang if she had the same problems that we had and did not drink the pink champagne Mfumo speaks of. Ultimately, panel, humans have pleasures, consumerism exists regardless of that, but what is important is we are allowed to indulge however we choose, whether it's through buying it or through watching it. I'm proud to be on closing opposition.